I'll pass it on to you.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk a little bit more about my work. So yeah, we'll get started. My name is Megan Striha. As you mentioned, I am a senior epidemiologist. I work for the Public Health Agency of Canada, specifically on the Outbreak Management Division. So we're a group of about 30 people strong, and we investigate multi-jurisdictional enteric illness outbreaks. So I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a sec. So just a quick outline of what I'm going to talk to you about today. I'll explain a little bit more about our work and how we do our work at the Outbreak Management Division, and then I'm going to summarize some highlights from 5 multi-jurisdictional outbreak investigations that occurred through 2023 through about early 2025, and they are listed there for your reference, and we'll talk about all 5 of them. So first I have a poll question. I just wanted to get to a little bit better idea who's here. So maybe I can tailor a little bit of what I'm going to talk to you about based on kind of your experience or where you are at in your journey. So I'll just pause while we do the poll here. My apologies if I missed a key group. I tried to hit kind of some of the bigger categories I thought would be here, but I think based on how many are other, I think I've missed some important categories, so my apologies. But I'm seeing a few students, some staff and faculty, a couple epidemiologists, so that's good to know I'm in some company there, and lots of other, which unfortunately I'm not going to be able to see who exactly you are, so my apologies for missing some key groups. All right, so we'll keep going. Just close that out. Okay, so to get us started, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what foodborne illness is. So in Canada, it's really quite common. About 1 in 8 people get sick from food each year, or about 4 million people total, so quite a bit. The most common pathogens that are associated with foodborne illness outbreaks are norovirus, Listeria, Salmonella, E. coli, especially E. coli 0157, and Campylobacter. And then in addition to foodborne illnesses is usually how we term it, but we say enteric illnesses because they can also be caused by animal contact, so zoonotic sources. And those total about 85,000 enteric illnesses in Canada related to animal contact each year. So when there is enteric outbreak happening and it's occurring in a single jurisdiction, the investigation is going to be led by local public health. So for example, if there's something that happens at like a wedding or a local event, that would be handled locally by public health officials. If there's something happening where cases are spread across a whole province or maybe multiple health units, then the provincial agency will get involved. So for BC, BCCDC. And then where my team comes in is if we are seeing cases from a single outbreak occurring in multiple jurisdictions. So multiple provinces is the most common, but sometimes it could be one province and another country as well, like the US most often because we share so much of our food source with them. So we identify cases that are related to the same source via whole genome sequencing. So if there's any lab folks, you will know about whole genome sequencing. But basically, when people are really ill, sometimes they'll go to the doctor, not always, but sometimes they'll go to the doctor and have a sample collected, usually a stool sample, sometimes it's blood, sometimes it's urine. And from that sample, the lab will be able to confirm what pathogen is making them sick, such as Salmonella. And then from there, we go a step further and look at the genome of the Salmonella and sequence it. So once we have that sequencing information from the Salmonella, we can look at the sequencing of other Salmonella cases in Canada and see if the genomes are related. So when we have genomes from cases that are closely related, we know that they're likely sick from a similar or the same source. So we know that it's an outbreak, they're related, and we investigate them to look for a common source. So this diagram explains a little bit about who works on these multi-jurisdictional enteric illness outbreaks. So in the gray circle there, kind of in the center, there are the 4 key partners. The federal partners are the Public Health Agency of Canada, so that includes my team, but it also includes the National Microbial Laboratory and some other teams as well. And then, of course, we have the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, or CFIA, and they do all of the regulatory compliance and enforcements, and they do a lot of the food safety investigations. And then we have Health Canada, whose primary role is policies and health risk assessments. They also have some laboratories that do research specifically on Salmonella and other pathogens, so they're sometimes quite helpful to us as well. And then the final really key partner is the local and provincial government and health partners. So BC CDC, for example, for BC is a really key partner we work closely with. And then outside that circle, partners that we sometimes work with include international partners. Like I mentioned, sometimes we have overlap in outbreaks with the US, so we work closely with the CDC. And sometimes we work with the European, their group is the ECDC, European Center for Disease Control. So we share information with them as well. We've also talked to Australia in the past, depends kind of who's experiencing maybe related cases and outbreaks, and we will work with them. And then also industry. So sometimes we'll work with industry, especially if their product is implicated in an outbreak. Usually CFIA will be the main contact with them. But of course, we share information with them to help them figure out what the problem might be in their facility and work towards making sure that people are safe with the food that's being produced. All right, so we'll get to the first outbreak. So this is an outbreak. It was two different types of Salmonella in one outbreak. So it was I4512I minus and Typhimurium. And these two Salmonellas came from a snake and feeder rodent outbreak. So this outbreak investigation started around April 2023. And right off the top, we had people reporting pet snakes and the feeder rodents that are used to feed the snakes. So when you see a few of those being reported right away, it really sticks out because it's not something that's super usual. So that gave us a clue right away that this was going to be a zoonotic outbreak. And zoonotic outbreaks, just to talk a little bit more about them in general, they're really different from a foodborne outbreak, as you can imagine. It's a lot more difficult to control these outbreaks. So with food, we can do a recall, we can tell people to throw out their food, but these are people's pets, and of course, we can't do a recall or anything like that. So it's a lot harder to take action, and it usually comes down to trying to do public awareness and education and things like that. So we have to be a little bit more creative with these outbreaks and how to manage them and slow or stop cases. So specifically in this outbreak, we did have 76 cases. It was across 8 provinces. Half of the cases were female, and we had the full range of ages from 0 to 96 in this one. But if you notice, the median is a little bit younger at 23 and a half years, and that's really quite common for our zoonotic outbreaks. I think I talk a little bit about it in a future slide, but the younger cases kids tend to put things in their mouths and maybe don't have the best hand hygiene. So it's often related to our zoonotic outbreaks if there's a pet in the home. On the right-hand side, we have the epi curves. You can see the cases over time. And then at the bottom, I'll point out that the exposure to source, so that's the amount of cases that we interviewed, was 62, and 52% of them did positively report having contact with a snake or the feeder rodents used to feed the snake. So about 84%. That's actually pretty common in our outbreaks to not have all cases remember the source. There could be, maybe snakes is a little harder maybe to forget, but sometimes people forget what they've eaten or what they've been in contact with, or if they've had cross-contamination, they might not know. So moving along to some epi information. So as I mentioned, we noticed right away that snakes were being highly reported. And when we have that happen, we're able to quickly adapt a questionnaire for cases that focuses in on those reptiles, the feeder rodents, and some of the behavioral information and how cases interact with their pets. So we can gather that information. And as I was mentioning, yes, this outbreak was one of the ones that disproportionately affected children, unfortunately. So 17% were 5 and under, and 26%, so a quarter of the cases were 10 and under. And then in addition to interviewing cases who became sick, we also did some interviews of pet stores, suppliers, and like snake breeders. So different people kind of in the industry or up the chain of where people would get their pets from. So we wanted to do those interviews to kind of better understand the industry as a whole, to get an idea of different like behaviors and practices that happen in the industry and just kind of learn more about it. So that was helpful to us in guiding some of our actions and education that we took. For traceback and sampling, the outbreak strains of Salmonella were taken from two different case homes where local public health had went in and swabbed kind of like the inside of like the tank of the snake or their home. And we also had frozen feeder mice taken and sampled as well. And outbreak strains of Salmonella were found in those as well. So kind of when we get these nice positive samples, it really confirms for us that we're on the right track or we've positively identified the source of the outbreak. So that's always nice to have. And then we also, as I mentioned, we did some other interviews. Cases were specifically asked where they got their snakes and feeder rodents. And when we did those interviews, kind of going up the chain, we identified a very complex network of pet stores and suppliers and breeders. We were hoping potentially we would kind of do that trace back and find maybe there's just one breeder that was having an issue with the salmonella, and we could maybe take kind of more concrete action with like a single breeder, a single supplier. But that's not how it turned out, unfortunately. It was kind of just this massive web of people, their snakes had babies and they sold them back. And it didn't really work out that way. So it's really unfortunate there was no way to take action from that kind of standpoint. Public health action, I have one of these slides for each of the outbreaks. It's kind of text heavy, but I'll just explain what I'm talking about here. So a public health alert or PHA is a bit of text we put together when we first know we have an outbreak going on. And generally, we don't know the source at this point. So we will put out a PHA through the Canadian Network for Public Health Intelligence or CINFI. And that the audience of that alert is other public health officials, so local public health, provincial public health, and it's just to let them know that, okay, we have a new outbreak, this is a serotype, this is what's going on, this is what we know so far, and to let them know that this is happening and maybe there's some action they can do to help us, such as asking specific questions when they interview cases and things like that. So that product is for public health officials. And then later, once we know the source and we've confirmed the source, we do a public health notice, and that's a public-facing product. It's usually accompanied by social media messaging, and it's to inform the people in Canada of the outbreak, of the source, give them some information on how to protect their health. We'll link to recalls if it's a food product and there's recalls available and so on. So for this one, the public health alert went out on April 11th, and then the PHN went out 2 days later on April 13th, because again, we figured out right away that this was a snakes and feeder rodents related outbreak. In addition to that, so we have to be a little bit more creative, as I said, for controlling these outbreaks. So we communicate a lot with the pet industry. We have some partners that we work with pretty regularly, and we work with them collaboratively to try and find opportunities to raise awareness of people who own these types of pets and trying to educate them and industry partners on how to protect their health if they have one of these pets in the home. And then we also held a webinar for pet industry members like breeders, suppliers, retailers, and we shared with them our investigation and the outcomes, and just to hopefully try and increase awareness again as another type of outreach. So key takeaways from this outbreak. Of interest, I think 44% of cases reported they didn't actually come in direct contact with the snake. So they may live in the home with the snake, but they never kind of directly handled it or the food. But maybe they touched, the container, the tank, whatever the enclosure is that the snake lives in. Maybe they, after cleaning it, there was something left in the sink, so on. So we know that people can become sick without that direct contact and through the cross-contamination with having a reptile in the home. In addition, 52% of cases reported that they did not know that their reptile could cause salmonella. So it's really unfortunate for half of people who own snakes to not know about this risk, because that it decreases their, likelihood of maybe taking some extra hand washing steps and so on that might protect them from becoming ill. And more than that, 71% did not know about the risk between Salmonella and feeder rodents. So again, a little disheartening, but something we are trying to work on and improve. So cases in this outbreak have continued. I showed the epi curve from when we stopped investigating because we knew the source, but we do eventually close our outbreak investigations. But we do continue to get cases reported that are related to this outbreak. And again, we try and we're working on longer term strategies to try and increase awareness and slow down or stop these illnesses, but it's quite challenging. Okay, the next outbreak I'm going to talk to you about was an outbreak that was linked to cantaloupes. It was a Salmonella outbreak, and in the end, there were three different serotypes identified from the cantaloupe. It was Sohanina, Oranienburg, and Newport. So this one occurred in late 2023, and it was actually a really great example. I'll talk a little bit more about it, but right off the top, we had a cantaloupe that was sampled by CFIA through their National Microbiological Monitoring Program. So this program tests different foods in Canada, especially foods that are of a higher risk for being contaminated. And they happened to sample a cantaloupe that was contaminated with salmonella. So those cantaloupes were immediately recalled, of course. But unfortunately, those cantaloupes were already in circulation in Canada. So they'd already crossed the border, they've already gone to retail, and people had already eaten them before that sample turned positive. So I'll talk a little bit more about this one. This was quite a large outbreak, so we did have 190 cases. It was in 9 provinces and territories, so really almost everywhere. 55% of the cases were female. The age range was again really wide, 0 to 100, and you'll notice here the median age was actually a little bit older, 60 years old. And you can see on the right the epi curve where cases peaked. This is kind of standard for something that's a fresh produce item because generally, I mean, some people might freeze cantaloupe, but generally it's only good for a certain period of time, and that, one lot comes in and gets people sick for a kind of condensed period of time, and then you'll see it trail off pretty quickly after that. And in the end, 73% of people remembered eating cantaloupe and reported to us that they had eaten cantaloupe in their exposure period. So because we started out knowing that the source of the illnesses was cantaloupe, we had the answer right from the hop. We were again able to do a focus questionnaire for 145 cases and ask specifically about cantaloupes and other melons. There were actually quite a few subclusters identified in this investigation, including daycares, retirement residents, and restaurants. So a lot of the cantaloupes were put into products that would go to these types of facilities. And then of the 145 interviews that were done, actually local public health did quite a few of them. So generally we do re-interviews at OMD, at the Public Health Agency of Canada. But in this one, there were so many and they were happening in such a short period of time. We had a lot of hands on deck from local public health, and we were really grateful for that assistance. And then this outbreak was interesting because it was a little bit more severe than the typical Salmonella outbreak. So in total, 40% of 30 to 39, 40% of cases were hospitalized, and actually 5% of cases died, which is not something we typically see in our Salmonella outbreaks. So quite severe. And we think part of that reason is because there were so many people that were young and older adults also affected. So 33% were 5 and younger, and 45% were 65 and older. And I think goes part and parcel with that. A lot of this cantaloupe went to daycares and retirement residences, so really kind of unfortunate there. And then I will say the US also had the exact same outbreak happening at the exact same time from the same cantaloupes that they also received. And they ended up with 407 cases across 44 states. Just going to take a sip of water. Okay, so food safety. As I mentioned, the CFIA's monitoring program picked up that cantaloupe right away with their detection, so we knew the source right off the top. They were able to do more sampling and traceback activities, and another brand of cantaloupe was identified and recalled. And eventually, all of the contaminated cantaloupes were traced back to a single grower in Mexico. So unfortunately, this is quite common, but unfortunately, the root cause of contamination of like what happened to those melons to make them contaminated was never identified. Um, of course, with the grower being in Mexico, that makes it a lot harder for us. But even when the facility is in Canada, it can also be quite difficult to understand what exactly happened to lead to the contamination of the food. Public health action, we had the public health alert that went out on November 17th, and the very same day, the public health notice went out because, again, we already knew the source right from the start. And in the end, there were 9 food recall warnings for the Malakita and the Rudy brand cantaloupes. And then there were secondary recalls for fruit trays, fruit salads, pre-cut fruits, smoothies, things that were made from those initial whole cantaloupes. The key takeaways from this one, this was the largest outbreak of salmonella linked to cantaloupes that has occurred in North America. There's been a couple, but this was by far the largest. Starting the investigation with the source already known saved us quite a bit of time because otherwise we would have had to ask, do the full hypothesis generating questionnaire, ask cases what they're eating, and try and sort out what it was that was in common. And because this one was so severe in hospitalizations and deaths, I do believe that this one, knowing that source right from the start, probably saved a lot of illnesses and maybe some lives as well. So that was quite key. And then we did have some different types of communication products for this one. So as I mentioned, daycares and retirement homes were quite highly affected. So we developed some letters to go out to those types of partners, or partners that could share those with the daycares and long-term care facilities under their purview, and just to let them know, don't serve any more cantaloupes. This outbreak's ongoing. Please be careful, things like that. So it's a different type of communication product to be developed. All right, we're going to swing back around to geckos, to another reptile-related one. So this is actually 2 in 1. Salmonella alone was a separate outbreak from the Salmonella mentioned, but they were both linked to geckos, so I'm going to talk to you about both of them at the same time. So loam was March 2024, and the Munchen one occurred in September 2024, just a little bit later. So both were similar size, pretty small, 25 to 36 cases in 7 PTs. Both were 64% female. Age range was quite wide, and the median age was a little bit younger, especially for loam, less so for the Munchen outbreak. And you can see the onset dates. And in the end, 60 to 64% of cases were able to tell us that they had an exposure to a gecko. So I'll show you here. These are the epi curves. If you remember back to what the cantaloupe one looked like with the big peak, zoonotic ones tend to look more like this, more sporadic, more spread out. It's not a single point source. It's just pets that people have in their homes that occasionally make them sick. So the epi curves look quite distinct from something that's foodborne. For epi information, again, this is one that we put together quite quickly. It only takes a couple people telling us they have a pet gecko in their house for us to be like, okay, something's going on here with the geckos. So we were able to put out a questionnaire right away that was reptile focused and interview our cases using that and gather that exposure and behavior information. And again, these outbreaks disproportionately affected the kids. So 22% under 5 for loam and 16 under 10 for Munchen. In this one, we did have 1 positive sample. So this was in the loam investigation where local public health went to a case home and sampled inside the tank, and it was positive for the outbreak strain of Salmonella. So that was a nice little reassurance that we had the right source. And I think it was the loam one, but we specifically asked cases where they purchased their geckos. Again, we were looking for the kind of commonality for like a single source, maybe a single breeder. But again, we just found kind of this intertangled web. It just seems like, once again, these are just pets people have in homes and they have salmonella, unfortunately. For public health action, we had the public health alert in March. For loam, September for Munchen, and then the public health notices followed shortly for both. And then in this one, we did, again, communicate with the pet industry partners to try and amplify some of our public health messaging. And just like the snake outbreak, we had half of cases that didn't really have, or reported they didn't have contact with the reptile directly. They just maybe lived in the same home or came in contact with things it had come in contact with. And again, a very high proportion reporting not knowing about the risk of salmonella from reptiles. And this one, we also asked about the duration of how long people had owned their geckos or had them in their homes before they became sick. Our hypothesis was maybe that this was like, people were newly getting geckos and bringing in their home and getting sick right away. But that actually didn't turn out to be the case. So some people had owned their geckos for just a couple of days, but others had owned their geckos for like a year, maybe 2 years before they got sick. Um, so it really just underlines that geckos and other reptiles can carry salmonella just in their regular gut flora and their digestive tract, and they don't appear sick, and it's they're just regular, and things like stress or other factors can stress them out, leading to additional shedding, and then the contact happens for the human, and they become sick. So it's just not much we can do about it. There's nothing like veterinary wise that can be done about it as far as like antibiotics or anything. It's just part of their gut flora and it's natural, so it stays there. And yeah, unfortunately, it does make people ill. Okay, quick question. So prior to the last 15 minutes of talking I just did about this, I just was curious how many people were aware that pet reptiles and feeder rodents could cause salmonella in humans? So I'll pause for a minute while people respond to the poll because I'm aware of how many pet owners, like reptile owners, were aware of this, but the general population, I would expect probably less are aware. Let's see. Yeah, some people were aware of both. Some people were only aware of the reptile portion, not the feeder rodent, but half not aware of the risk. Okay, actually quite similar to what the cases report. Let those finalize and get the results up. Working in public health probably we're probably disproportionately more aware than the general public as well. But that's interesting to know that 54% were not aware of the risk. So good, we made a little bit of progress today in sharing that message. All right, we'll get back to a foodborne illness. So this one is Listeria monocytogenes linked to plant-based refrigerated beverages or plant-based milk. This was an outbreak that occurred back in July 2024. So again, it's a small one, but Listeria is a more serious illness most of the time. So fewer cases is still quite concerning. So this one had 20 cases across 4 provinces, but the majority were in Ontario. 65% were female. The age range was slightly tighter and leaning a little older, with 58 years old being the median. And in the end, 19 of 19 cases we spoke to actually did report the source. So this is pretty uncommon for us to have that full 100% remembering the exposure that was the source of the outbreak. In this one, how it was solved, well, first of all, this was led mostly by Public Health Ontario. So by time we were involved, by time it became multi-jurisdictional, Ontario had already had majority of the cases and were well on their way to solving it before we were even kind of involved in the process. So huge kudos to them for the solve on this one. But it was really local public health that was investigating. They were talking to the cases, and they had cases with samples still in their home, and they took those samples and they found the outbreak strain of Listeria in a open sample of unsweetened coconut milk. So that was super interesting and really great to have that early catch again. And then once an open sample tests positive, CFA generally does require a closed sample to test positive as well to confirm, because as you can imagine, if you're sick with Listeria and you maybe drink some milk straight out of the carton, you could contaminate the milk, and it's not the milk that's the source, you've just cross-contaminated it. So the closed sample really gives them the confirmation that this is the right source. So that happened pretty quickly after the open testing, and it was confirmed. And then, of course, there was traceback to where this product was produced. And at the facility, there was some swabbing done of like the production line and the things, the machines that fill the cartons and so on. And they did find the same outbreak strain of Listeria in the facility as well. And even though this one is located in Canada, there was never any kind of root cause established as to how the Listeria was introduced to the facility in the first place. So it's a bit of a frustrating part of this job is we don't usually get the whole story of what happened, but it's good to know, where it was happening and make sure that gets cleaned and fixed before the product continues to be made. Okay, public health action. The PHA went out on June 27th, and then the public health notice went out July 17th once we had the source identified. And then there were recalls issued in July 8th. It was 18 different products from Great Value brand and Silk brand. They're all plant-based milks. So the takeaways for this one, back to those local public health investigators, they really kept an open mind about possible sources because this isn't a source we'd seen before in a Listeria outbreak. I don't think anywhere. So it was kind of a new one. You usually, when Listeria, you think like deli meats and hot dogs and things like that. So it was a source that was a little bit unexpected, and keeping an open mind to sample anything and everything anyways was what helped solve this as quickly as it was. All right, last outbreak I'm going to talk to you about today. This is Salmonella enteritis linked to imported pastries. So this one we started out investigating in December 2024, and the outbreak continued into 2025. And it was linked to a variety of pastries that were from a single manufacturer in Italy. So in this outbreak, there were 79 cases from 5 different provinces. 59%, 60% of cases were female. Again, we had pretty wide age range. The median was 52 years. And then you can see on the right the epi curve of how cases occurred over time with that peak kind of end of November, early December. And in the end, we did have 72% of cases able to report to us that they did have one of these pastries, or we knew that they were at a location that served one of these pastries. So this was, I think, one of the only ones I'm talking about today that was truly a mystery. We really didn't know at the start of the outbreak and the investigation what the source was. So we had to use our generic hypothesis, generating interviews with cases to really figure out what people ate, where people went, what they were reporting, did they have pets, and we were starting pretty much from zero. So garlic initially was actually very highly reported, more than you would expect, and was pretty much our early suspect source in this one. There's a lot of food safety investigations that went on trying to sort out if the garlic aligned, if people were all eating the same brands and such. But that very quickly kind of fell apart. It didn't look like things were aligning. It didn't seem right. And a second thing we noticed is that many cases were reporting attending catered events, so things like weddings, Christmas parties, funerals, conferences, birthday parties, etc. And it was weird. We eventually had so much that we couldn't ignore it anymore, and we're like, something's going on with these events. So what we ended up doing was asking for the menus and invoices from all of those caterers and to see if they'd ordered a product and served a product that was the same across all of these different businesses and different parties and events. So that was ended up being what the key was to solving this one. So the invoices were collected by local public health, local investigators from all of these different caterers across the country. And we started going through them, pages and pages of invoices, and we saw the same exact item on multiple of them. It's listed there for you. And what that item corresponded to was this a big carton of 12 different types of pastries that I think there was 10 of each to total 120. So a format that would be good for catering, of course, with that many items in it. And contained things like cheesecakes and cream puffs and some other things. And we learned eventually that though that single item, the carton of 120, was imported by one company into Canada from one single company in Italy, and then it was distributed to Alberta, BC, Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia, which is exactly where all the cases were located. Oh, yes, and then further epidemiological and food safety investigation done by CFIA uncovered that there were actually a couple of other products that were coming from that same company in Italy that were also contaminated. So there ended up being a couple more items following that carton that was used by the caterers. So public health alert was issued when we first noticed the outbreak in December 13th, and then it took us just over a month to solve the outbreak and figure out that source, and that public health notice was then released on January 19th. There were 3 food recall warnings issued. So the first was for that mini patisserie carton that was on January 18th. And then we also found the DeFay brand Lemon Delight and Tartlet with forest fruits. These are kind of bigger items that were served more like a bakery counter at your grocery store. But even with the different brand names, they were actually from the same manufacturer. And then there was also some frozen pastries that we found that you would buy frozen and bake yourself that were also contaminated. So there's an additional recall later for that as well. So key takeaways on this one, it was a really challenging one to identify the source, kind of one of more of our traditional outbreaks where we had to pull out all of the investigative stops to figure out what's going on. And this item was apparently surprisingly forgettable. People just didn't really report eating it, or if they did, they're like, "Wow, it was, I had some little cakes," or they kind of talked about it broadly because it was 12 different items. So, 12, people were reporting to us 12 different things if they even remembered having it. So it made it really, really difficult. Um, and yeah, I think we sent a lot of these pastries to our research laboratory, and 8 out of 12 ended up testing positive for Salmonella. So there's potentially some cross-contamination when these are being made, or maybe a single ingredient used in multiple that ended up causing multiple of these pastries to be positive for Salmonella. Okay, that's pretty much takes us through the outbreak. So the last question I have for everyone is I'm just curious which one of these outbreaks you've heard of, if any. So I think hopefully it's set up so you can select all that you are aware of, but I'm just curious which ones kind of make it out to the public the most, or maybe other public health professionals the most. Okay, so I'm seeing the results come in. It looks like geckos and feeder rodents are a little less. Mini pastries maybe a little less too, but cantaloupes and plant-based milks are a little higher. Yeah, okay, that's kind of what I expect. I think those two, the silk milk and the cantaloupes, really made the news and made a kind of a bigger impression, I think, on the population than some of the other ones. Okay, interesting. Yeah, mini pastries is maybe the least well known. Interesting. That one, it makes sense too because that one didn't really go to people's homes. It was more gone to like retailers or caterers. So there wasn't as much action for the public to take on that one either. I think it should be displaying the results now. Okay, so cantaloupes was the most widely recognized and followed by the plant-based milks. Very interesting. Thanks everybody for your participation. All right, so to wrap up, I'm just going to talk quickly about some of the keys to success overall in our work. And I've kind of hammered home these points throughout the presentation, but just to kind of reiterate, what's important to us and how we're successful for these outbreaks. So rapid identification of the source and then the rapid response is really quite key. And that was clear in the Listeria outbreak. That was Listeria can be so serious. So that quick identification through the positive milk sample from the case's home was really key. And then the cantaloupe investigation as well. It was so serious that having that positive cantaloupe right from the start was really changed the ballgame on that one. Having an open mind, I talked about this one in the Listeria outbreak. So yeah, we probably wouldn't have been regularly thinking about plant-based refrigerated beverages as a possible source, but as a practice and a rule, we don't really rule out much of anything when we're investigating for this exact reason. It could surprise us sometimes. Multiple strategies can really be necessary and required. So the mini pastry one was a very clear example of how we had to go and about things a little bit of a different way. Asking cases what they ate just wasn't getting us where we needed to be. And it was really those invoices that tipped us over and tipped off tipped us off to the source of the outbreak. So we have to kind of think outside the box sometimes and try pulling on some different threads to be able to figure out what's going on. Outbreaks as an opportunity to collect data that informs longer term health approaches. This is really key in our zoonotic ones. So as I said, we really are limited to kind of increasing public awareness and education about the risk of salmonella with reptiles. So when we talk to cases about their exposures, we take the time to ask them, how do they clean their pet's tank or their enclosure and, do they touch them directly and how do they do feedings and things like that. So we can kind of understand what cases do that might make them more at risk, and that helps us target some of our education and messaging. And then the final one that I want to end on is about collaboration, because if it was just my team, we wouldn't get anywhere. We have to have the collaboration with CFIA, Health Canada, and the provinces and territories to get that case information. Um, and even like industry partners and things like that really are critical to the job. So it's a really a big group effort. So just a shout out to all the partners that collaborate on these regularly with us. And that is the end of my presentation. But I am going to quickly plug, if you guys scan the QR code, we have the Enteric Outbreak seminar series that's put on by my team. And every single outbreak I talked about is its own hour-long seminar itself. So if you want more detail about any of those, I would recommend you go and watch those. And we also have, I think we're done 2 of 3 of a series right now about that goes into kind of how we do our work and how we investigate these and a little bit more about the process. So yeah, if you're more interested, please check it out. But thank you. Thank you for having me.